It was on March 21st, 2016 that Apple would take to the stage and do something unprecedented, announce a brand new iPhone only 6 months after their most recent launch. 10 days later, the iPhone Special Edition would officially release alongside the 9.7-inch iPad Pro, and if there's one word to describe this unnumbered iPhone, special would be about right. The SE took the design of the 2013 iPhone 5S and merged it with the hardware and power of the iPhone 6s and 6s Plus, and all for a substantially cheaper price tag than Apple's foremost flagships, starting at $400 versus $650 for the 6s. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today I thought we'd take a look at what I believe to be one of the greatest iPhones Apple has ever made, the 2016 iPhone SE first generation. What is it that makes this phone so special, and how does it hold up fast approaching a decade later?
So some people asked us, some people even pleaded with us to please keep the 4-inch products in our lineup. Well, today we're going to do just that, and we're going to make it a whole lot better. And as you may have heard, we're calling it the iPhone SE.
It's been a while since we've taken a look at an older iPhone. In fact, I don't think I've talked about the first SE since 2021, hard to believe, but I've been looking at some older Android phones lately, such as the 2016 Samsung Galaxy S7, and while the SE might look like it's from another world compared to the S7, it actually was announced only 10 days after Samsung's flagship. It also feels about right to talk about this phone due to the fact that the SE is no longer a thing. After 3 generations, it's been completely replaced by Apple's new iPhone 16e. Not that the second or third gen SE really match what the first one brought to the table to begin with. What made this phone so unique wasn't just the smaller size and the older build, although that certainly helped it stand out. It's easy to forget, but this design from the iPhone 5S wasn't even 3 years old when this phone released. While 3 years isn't a lot of time, phones had radically shifted to these larger phablet form factors at a rate that was rather unprecedented, and it left a substantial number of users in the dust. And as Apple shows in their presentation of the SE, this size was still a desired commodity. Even by 2016, a flagship smartphone in a compact form factor was quite rare, and it was the main appeal of a phone like this. But while it was very important to the SE's identity and success, what really made the special edition so truly special is how radically different it was from any iPhone that came before, even if it did physically look identical to the 5S. Not only was this Apple's first mid-cycle release, prior to this we had only seen one big iPhone launch per year, but it was also Apple's first true attempt to making a phone geared towards the more budget-oriented market. Now I do say true attempt because technically the iPhone 5C came out in 2013 and, well, it was an attempt, I guess, just a rather poor one, and it's still considered Apple's biggest flop in iPhones to date, perhaps even their only big flop. It still sold quite well compared to most other smartphones, but nowhere near what the 5S was doing, and it's pretty obvious why. The 5C brought a plastic polycarbonate build with the same hardware and specs of the iPhone 5, replacing that device outright, all for only $100 cheaper than the 5S, which was a substantially better device and far better value. You gained a faster 64-bit chip with the 5S that ultimately would receive 2 more years of major software support. You had the luxurious premium aluminum and glass design, which really helps shape the perception of a phone as being much higher quality. And then of course, you had everyone's favorite new feature in Touch ID. The 5C on the other hand really had nothing going for it beyond its flashy colors, which were fun, but not nearly enough to carry sales. In short, Apple's first attempt at making a budget iPhone was a complete failure, and critically, it wasn't really priced as a budget phone to begin with. It was posited as being a new iPhone, but it had all the hardware of an iPhone already a year old, and in the earlier days of smartphones, things really moved fast in the industry, rendering those specs obsolete much quicker than you would see today. Comparing this to the special edition iPhone, and it's immediately clear why this phone was so much better received. First, Apple staggered the releases. Instead of bogging down the iPhone 6s launch with the iPhone SE, they waited 6 months, and I think that made a lot of sense. Second, the iPhone SE didn't give the impression of looking or feeling cheap. It wasn't plastic, but rather had the exact same design as the iPhone 5S, which to this day is still one of the most beautiful and premium smartphones ever built without any doubt. Thus, despite the lower price tag of the SE, it doesn't simply feel like a budget version of the 6S, but rather more of a smaller version of that phone. That also happens to be a lot cheaper. The big thing here is that the SE had all the same specs as the 6S. Instead of, say, throwing the iPhone 6 chipset in here along with the old camera sensor, Apple put in their newest A9 chip, 2GB of RAM, the new 12-megapixel camera. This was a genuine flagship capable of going toe-to-toe with the best of the smartphone market. Add in the new rose gold color, and suddenly what's old was very much feeling new again. The SE would also end up including what were currently 6S exclusive features like live photos and Hey Siri activation without the need to be plugged in. Yeah, these were the days where your iPhone always listening to you for the phrase Hey Siri was still a pretty new concept. We also had Apple Pay here, which you needed an iPhone 6 or newer for. Really, there were only a few major concessions that came with the SE compared to the 6S. You still had the old selfie camera, no 3D touch, and first generation Touch ID. Aside from that, the phone was basically an iPhone 6S mini in all the best possible ways.
Of course, with a small phone comes a small battery, and while the iPhone SE is better in this regard than you might expect, as we'll get into, if you had one back in the day, you were probably reaching for a charger fairly frequently as the years went by. Which just so happens to lead us into today's sponsor, Anker. Has this ever happened to you? You find your cell phone low power at the worst possible time. Maybe your brand new Switch 2 only gets you a couple hours of playing Cyberpunk before it dies, or you're still rocking an iPhone 12 or 13 mini and only make it half a day before you need to recharge. Whatever your use case, Anker has you covered with their 250 watt, 27,000 plus milliamp hour power bank. It might be small, but it's capable of charging your iPhone 14 4 times over with juice to spare. And mind you, that's fast charging too on both Android and iPhone. There's even an app that connects over Bluetooth so you can have complete control over your battery life. Or if you have an outlet available, you can always use Anker's 140 watt adapter with its 4 USB ports to juice up all your devices incredibly fast. It'll charge a 15-inch MacBook Air to 50% in just 30 minutes. As someone who's traveling soon, I'm definitely going to be taking this to keep my Switch 2 alive for the 6-hour plane ride, and once I arrive to my Airbnb, I'll be using this to quickly juice up all my devices at once. Links to both these products at a huge discount for Prime Day will be in the description below. This is Anker's biggest, most exclusive deal of the year. You won't see these at this price again for a while, so make sure you take advantage now before Prime Day ends. For what it's worth, I've been using Anker for years outside of being sponsored by them anyways, because they're a great brand, so huge thanks to them for making this video possible. And again, check out those links in the description below for that exclusive Prime Day deal. The clock is ticking, so take advantage now. But yeah, let's get right back into this, talking about the most striking element of the iPhone SE in the design, and then we'll get into the hardware and experience.
So let me show it to you. So we start with this beloved aluminum design, but we've made some beautiful refinements, including this gorgeous rose gold finish. We've added matte chamfered edges and an inset stainless steel Apple logo, just like the iPhone 6S.
I'm not sure there's any smartphone design more gorgeous, premium, and well-crafted than that of the iPhone 5, 5S, and SE. And I don't think it's any coincidence that smartphones since the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro in 2020 have in a way reverted back to a lot of the design elements we saw in these phones. Seriously, if you look at basically any modern flagship from the past few years, you'll probably see one major commonality: flat sides and antenna bands near the corners. This was really first done with the iPhone 4, but it was the iPhone 5 that refined it and made for this seamless all-in-one unibody shell. The 5S would reuse the iPhone 5 design while adding Touch ID and a gold color, being the first major iPhone to test the waters outside of the conventional white and black color scheme. The iPhone SE is almost 100% identical to the 5S, with the easiest way to tell them apart being the SE badge. Plus, rose gold is only on the SE, and then you have your other colors in space gray, silver, and gold. The space gray actually got a little lighter on the SE versus the 5S, which I do think I prefer, honestly. It's subtle, but I like that Apple cared enough to change it. One color lost to time was the black and slate of the iPhone 5 due to the poor durability. The paint would chip and scratch far too easily, which is a shame because I really love that color, but the space gray is fantastic too. You've got that seamless premium aluminum contrasting perfectly with the glass on the top and bottom of the phone for the sake of the antennas, and it's just so beautiful. I always felt like the Nexus 6P and early Google Pixel phones kind of stole this look, but honestly I was all for it. There's something about that two-tone look that really makes these old phones stand out, capped off by the reflective Apple logo. And that camera sitting flush at the top corner of the phone, no bump in sight. It's pretty cool that Apple was able to do this, especially considering this is the same sensor that was in the 6S, a phone that did have a camera bump, albeit a small one. There are actually a couple super minor differences in the design coming from the 5S. These chamfered, angled edges were polished and shiny on the 5S, whereas the SE has a matte finish to them. It's a subtle thing, but I do think I prefer the matte look on the SE, and the Apple logo here is also inset stainless steel, which I think looks nicer and it doesn't scratch as easily as whatever exactly they did with the 5S. The SE is technically thicker than the iPhone 6S, but it doesn't feel cumbersome whatsoever, and it's incredibly lightweight at only 113 grams. This technically isn't the lightest iPhone of all time, but it might as well be. The iPhone 5 and 5S both just barely have it beat at only 112 grams. For some perspective, the iPhone 16 Pro is 199 grams, and that's the smaller one. It's hard to balance having such a light phone while still having it feel like high quality. I've used plenty a light plastic Android phone, but the premium materials here ensure that the phone still feels amazing in the hand, and the small size makes it extremely comfortable to both hold and use. It isn't delicate or dainty thanks to the aluminum build. Those glass sections on the back can absolutely crack, but I'd feel much more comfortable dropping this phone than I would a newer iPhone from any height. Now once you throw a case on here, the SE does get substantially more cumbersome, a bit like a brick, especially if you're using an old thick OtterBox or something. It's also worth pointing out how older cases often have these circular little windows for the Apple logo, which is cool and all for the sake of showing off your iPhone, but after years of use, it can result in the paint fading. Still, it's really novel to me how popular those styles of cases were. iPhones used to be these genuine fashion statements, far more so than I think they're considered today, and with a design this perfect, it's easy to see why users would want to show it off. When you compare this phone's design to that of the second or third generation SE, well, there's really no comparison at all, is there? The first SE is easily the better looking phone, and I wouldn't consider it particularly close. There's nothing wrong per se with the newer generations that use the iPhone 8's design, simply centering the Apple logo. They've got the glass back, which is necessary for wireless charging, and then the general shape and curved aluminum sides that first came in the iPhone 6. They're also larger, which is more practical for most users these days. The problem is, this design is boring. It's simple, minimalist, and very safe. It's not offensive. The bright red color being an option is nice, but these phones look like Apple's budget offerings. The first SE never did. It just used a slightly older flagship design, that's all. You can argue that the SE2 and 3 having such plain designs were fine, and not really a downside given they were in fact budget iPhones, and what qualifies as a budget smartphone is all relative of course, but for Apple these were the budget iPhones. But I still can't help but feel Apple lost something critical here along the way. For me, what made the SE so special is that while it was most definitely the budget iPhone to buy, it never really felt like a budget phone. It was just a smaller flagship, that's all. I can't say the same for the second or third generation SE, they do feel like budget iPhones. If Apple of today was making the SE a decade ago, how much do you want to bet we'd have seen the iPhone 5C design reused instead of the 5S? I mean, that still would have been novel, but it would have felt cheap. The SE2 and 3 were not flagship iPhones, they were budget iPhones, but the first generation SE never felt the same way, at least to me. I might be giving old Apple a bit too much credit. After all, they just reused a popular design at a time where they had been producing iPhone 5s and 5Ss for years and figured they might as well get a bit more profit out of their already well-established assembly lines. But just because the design was older doesn't make it any less great or premium. iPhone 5, 5S, SE, take your pick, they're all fantastic, and they also hadn't yet overstayed their welcome, which I think is a crucial thing to remember here. The main point I'm trying to get across is how awesome it was for Apple to make this phone in the first place, and how amazingly well this design has held up, even if the small size makes it less than ideal for real-life usage at this point. This phone didn't feel like a budget iPhone, it felt like just another flagship at a lower price, just a bit smaller than the other ones.
But it's on the inside where the iPhone SE really shines. It's got advanced technologies that make this the most powerful 4-inch phone ever.
Speaking of size, let's finally turn to the front of the iPhone SE, where we're presented with that iconic 16:9 4-inch LCD Retina display, surrounded by relatively thick bezels and a physical home button. This is definitely a small screen, even by 2016 standards, and the 4.7-inch iPhone 6S feels quite large beside it, never mind the 5.5-inch 6S Plus. There was a reason Apple stuck with this form factor for so long, however. It was about the sweet spot for one-handed usage, which was an important quality for earlier smartphones. You may not remember this, but cell phones for years prior to iPhone had, on the whole, been getting smaller. Having a big phone was seen as an inconvenience, and the first iPhone itself was considered considered by reviewers to be quite large for 2007. But as time went on and what we did with smartphones would rapidly evolve, these pocket-sized devices became more and more essential to daily life, as we used them not simply just to text or make calls, but to actually consume content. Video streaming, social media, mobile gaming, these are things that are better experienced on a larger, innately more immersive phablet, rather than just the traditional 3.5 or 4-inch screen that Apple had been using for so long. The iPhone 5 going to a 16:9 ratio and making the display not wider but instead taller was a really good first step for Apple, and it was meant to sort of please both worlds. Even by 2012, there were two camps of consumers, one who preferred a smartphone to be smaller sized for the sake of ease of use, and the other that was craving the larger phablet displays that companies like Samsung were pushing. Now of course, by 2016, phablets had by and large taken over the market, but that first camp, while dwindling in number, hadn't yet completely disappeared. Apple releasing the iPhone SE was a surprisingly consumer-friendly move, showing they hadn't forgotten about the group that was only just recently Apple's core audience. And even today, while large displays are practically ubiquitous across the smartphone landscape, there is still a niche subset of users who prefer this small form factor, whether it be because of small hands, relative comfort, or just personal preference. I would say the iPhone 12 mini was essentially the spiritual successor to the first-gen iPhone SE, much more so than the SE2 or 3. It's nearly the same size, but it has an edge-to-edge display, and along with the 13 mini, these would be the final truly compact form factor flagship iPhones ever made, unfortunately. At this point, the smallest phone Apple offers is 6.1 inches, which isn't huge, but it's still pretty big compared to the old mini iPhones, and I do find it sad that Apple is so willing now to just leave behind so many users. Of course, battery life is one of the most common problems with a small phone. The 12 and 13 minis were always pretty rough here, as were the second and third gen SE. The first iPhone SE, however, it didn't compromise here as much as you would expect.
So even though it has all these new capabilities, and it's so much more powerful than the iPhone 5S, the iPhone SE delivers incredible battery improvements across the board.
The battery was slightly larger than it was in the iPhone 5 and 5S at 1,624 mAh, tiny by today's standards, but barely smaller than the battery in the regular 6S, and what's wild is it actually had superior battery life to that larger phone. Apple rates the iPhone 6S for 11 hours of video playback on their website's comparison tool versus 13 hours on the SE. That's a pretty big difference, with the 6S Plus only barely taking the crown at 14 hours of video playback total. The fact that this tiny phone was barely worse for battery life than the huge 6S Plus, that's genuinely miraculous, and probably was mainly thanks to the smaller size and thus lower resolution, which meant less pixels to push. Now of course, over time batteries do degrade, and just because the SE was better than the 6S for battery life doesn't mean it was necessarily good, especially after a couple years of usage and onward. In 2016, I'm sure it would have gotten you a day's use no problem, but as with any phone, that wouldn't last forever, as that battery health gradually gets worse, in tandem with software growing more intensive. Still, this was a legitimate reason to pick the SE over the 6S back in 2016, so props to Apple for nailing the battery life in such a small phone, something I don't think they've ever really successfully repeated.
Now it has Touch ID to keep the contents of your iPhone secure, but also quickly available to you. It's just a touch of your finger.
With the home button comes biometric security, specifically first-generation Touch ID. It's definitely a bit on the slow side, but so long as you keep your thumb on the home button long enough, it's still very consistent and reliable. No complaints here, it's more than good enough, and I think it was a clever spot for Apple to save some cash by not including the 6S's second-gen Touch ID sensor. That one is very fast and pretty impressive, as you can just barely touch your thumb to it and get into the phone, but it is still a relatively minor quality of life feature in the grand scheme of things. The most important factor is that you have a solid fingerprint sensor to begin with, and the SE provides just that. No 3D touch is one of those things that's actually aged really well in hindsight, given Apple never really figured out how they wanted to use it, and by the time the 2019 11 Pro rolled around, they just dropped it altogether. Later iOS versions would merge all the former Force Touch functionality with just long pressing, so you're not missing anything on the SE anymore with iOS 15. Kind of funny how that worked out, considering 3D touch was seen as one of the hottest new features on iPhones back in the day, but now if you have a 6S and an SE beside each other, there's really no benefit to having 3D touch anymore, or at least very little. On the bottom of the phone, we have both the Lightning port and headphone jack. This was actually the final iPhone to include the headphone jack, with the iPhone 7 dropping it later that year.
And of course, people love taking photos with their iPhones more than any other phone or camera. So we wanted to give it our most advanced camera system.
Let's move into photography, which was one of the best qualities of the iPhone SE, especially compared to its older brother in the iPhone 5S. First, what didn't change was the selfie camera. We're looking at a simple 1.2 megapixel sensor, I believe the exact same one that is found in the 5S. We do have the Retina flash feature on the SE though, which flashes the display for low light selfies. Yeah, one of those features we just kind of take for granted these days, but isn't on the 5S. Selfies are, realistically speaking, pretty awful by today's standards, and they weren't great for 2016 either. Video can only be filmed at 720p 30. The 6S had only just finally brought an upgraded 5 megapixel sensor, so this was one of the few definite downsides to the SE, but it also wasn't a category I think too many people were concerned with. This was generally going to be good enough for FaceTime, Snapchat, or whatever else you might need it for. It's the rear camera where things get more interesting. Here we have the same 12 megapixel sensor that we see on the 6S. Again, no camera bump at all, which is so refreshing versus iPhones of today. There is unfortunately no optical image stabilization, which was exclusively on the 6S Plus, but even without that, we're looking at what was easily one of the best shooters on any 2016 smartphone. Even today, in good lighting conditions, the SE is absolutely capable of taking a nice shot. Ideally outdoors during the day is where you'll probably see the best results. It's indoors, or in any poor lighting situation that the SE quickly will show its age. This came before the days of night mode photography, so you're looking at a lot of noisy, often blurry images. Like I've got these super cute pictures of my dog when she was still a pup the last time I reviewed this phone, but most of them are blurry. It's really too bad. Still, again, when you have ideal lighting, I found the SE to be quite impressive, and again, this was top of the line when this phone was released. It was one of the standout features of the 6S, and yet here we have that brand new 12 megapixel sensor on a $400 phone, as well as the 4K 30 video, which had been completely new to iPhone. And the video is really good. I must say it's held up quite well, although the lack of stabilization is noticeable with any movement. Back in the early days of my YouTube channel, actually, I would often use my iPhone 6S to capture B-roll in 4K, and this tiny little phone would have been just as capable as that one. It's great. All in all, while the cameras haven't aged that terribly well nearly a decade later, there's only so much you can expect, and having this quality from Apple's budget offering in 2016, yeah, this was pretty awesome, and I think Apple deserves a ton of credit for including that new sensor in the SE. Even without it, the SE still would have been popular, but its inclusion really helped put the phone over the edge, and it's something Apple wouldn't do again in their 2nd gen and 3rd gen SEs, which both still used the same camera as the 2017 iPhone 8. It all makes the first SE feel even more special in hindsight. This really was like a mini iPhone 6S, and I strongly believe that's precisely why it was such a success and so popular among its users.
So the iPhone SE, what does it cost? Well, we're going to start the price of the iPhone SE at only $399.
From its launch fall 2015, the iPhone 6S would run you $650 for the 16GB model, and the following March, the iPhone SE with much of the same hardware would cost you only $399 at the same amount of storage. Unfortunately, 16 gigs was in fact a pitiful amount of minimum space, and being the cheapest option, you know it was no doubt the most popular. I pity the poor suckers who got stuck with 16 gigs and used their phone all the way to iOS 15. This thing barely has enough space to download the new updates, and when your phone is close to full, it very much can also cause performance issues. Starting at 16 gigs is probably the only major strike against the iPhone SE and its value back in the day, although considering the 6S would cost at least another $250 and also sucked for storage, it's hard for me to hold it against this phone too harshly. If you wanted 64 gigs, which was a much more acceptable amount of storage, you'd be paying $500, which I still think would be a much better deal than a $650 16 gig 6S, or you could have waited a year when Apple would do something rather unprecedented. March 2017, Apple would refresh the SE's storage options to 32 and 128 gigabytes, at the exact same price point they'd already been. That's right, a year after the phone came out, Apple actually did something to ensure it stayed at a competitive value, especially with the new iPhone 7 itself starting at 32 gigabytes. Geez, imagine that. Reminder that Apple released the iPhone SE 3rd gen in 2022 at $429, and then left it untouched for nearly 3 years at the exact same price, which was never really good value to begin with. Oh, and it doesn't end there, because the fall of 2017, Apple would actually reduce the starting price of the SE to $350. Yeah, that's right, they lowered the price. Imagine the Apple of today doing that. Apple ultimately discontinued the iPhone SE September 2018, but we're still not done, because they temporarily brought it back January 2019 on clearance for only $250, or $300 for 128 gigs, and then it sold out within like a day. Then they brought it again a month later, and then again in March, and then that was it forever. This is, without any question, the best value iPhone Apple has ever made. And it was even better value when you consider the fact that the iPhone 5S prior to the SE's launch was not only still in Apple's lineup as their only 4-inch option, but it cost more than the SE would. That's right, the 5S started at $450 USD with 16 gigs when the 6S came out, whereas the SE would come in at $399 with the same amount of storage. It would have been so easy for Apple just to raise the price of the SE to $500, which probably would have still brought a ton of sales and might have even ultimately made Apple more money, but they didn't do that. The Apple of a decade ago is very different to the Apple of today. For the price point, the hardware the iPhone SE brought just couldn't be matched. So let's look a little closer at what we have here.
So at the heart of the iPhone SE, of course, is our chips, our amazing Apple A9 chip with its embedded M9 motion coprocessor.
Powered by Apple's A9 chipset and 2 GB of RAM, the little phone that could would ship on iOS 9.3 and receive updates through to iOS 15. And it's even seen a security update as recently as March 2025, at least as of making this video. The fact that Apple is still giving any level of support for this phone is astounding, even if it hasn't had major software support since 2022. Like, this is a crazy amount of updates for a phone this old, and it speaks to both Apple's commitment to long-term support, as well as the quality and power of the SE's hardware. The A9 chip was a substantial jump from the iPhone 6's A8, which is in part why the iPhone 6 only saw updates to iOS 12, while the 6S got to iOS 15. Mind you, the bigger difference was probably the fact that the 6S had double the amount of RAM with 2 GB, as did the SE. If Apple had cheaped out and put the iPhone 6 processor and RAM in the SE, this phone would have been stuck on iOS 12 along with the 5S. But Apple didn't do that, they didn't cheap out, they went all out. I do find it amazing just how long the iPhone SE and 6S managed to last. The 6S had 7 years of major software updates spanning from fall 2015 to fall 2022. That's wild, and the fact that Apple's apparent budget device from around the same time was able to keep pace with it every step of the way. Look, people can hate on Apple all they want and claim planned obsolescence. I'd say most of the time Apple deserves the criticism, but you really cannot question their commitment to keeping these phones usable for as long as possible, at least at a software level, and as much as you might expect this phone to just chug on its latest version, it actually runs fairly smoothly.
This means that the iPhone SE has the same processing performance as the iPhone 6S, which is literally double the speed of the iPhone 5S.
I wouldn't call the SE on iOS 15 fast, it's not, and I actually do have an SE on iOS 12 that I was messing around with for fun, and I'd say I saw a bit less lag and random slowdowns using that device, but the experience really didn't feel a whole lot different. And iOS 15 isn't too bumpy by any means, at least when it comes to just navigating the basics and user interface. Once it's booted up and been used for a while, it seems just fine. When it comes to more intensive tasks and apps, you are probably going to feel a bit more limited, especially if you have the unfortunate burden of only 16 gigabytes in storage. You barely have to take any pictures or download anything for this thing to fill right up. It's pitiful, and Apple should be frankly embarrassed for selling it as late as early 2017 before they upped it to 32 gigs. Even so, this phone runs just fine, at least in my experience with it, and having a healthy battery will be a big factor here for how the phone feels. And when I say fine, I mean that it performs within an acceptable range of lag for me, but my definition of acceptable certainly requires keeping in mind the age of this device. There's some pain here that even I would experience in my relatively short time using the phone for this review. For example, this SE was initially on an older version of iOS 15 since I hadn't used it in a bit, but I couldn't download the new update due to not having enough storage space. It required like 4 gigabytes or something crazy. I did my best to clear as much space as possible, but eventually gave up, reset the phone, and then updated, which took the device probably like 20 minutes to do. At this point, I eventually signed into my Apple ID to be able to use the App Store, and this itself was at least a 10-minute process as it very slowly loaded things in, and then painfully allowed me to turn off iCloud photos and all the other things that it would turn on by default, like iCloud backups. Note how long it takes for the Backup Now option to disappear after turning it off, and this was a lot quicker than the first time I tried, when it froze up the settings app for like a solid minute before it finally started working again. Now, mind you, it did actually work, and I didn't experience any actual crashes or bugs that I noticed, which speaks well to the stability of this device in spite of its age, especially considering how relatively modern the software is. It's in a state where doing anything remotely intensive probably is going to be quite slow, but it's still doable, and that's pretty impressive all things considered.
Fundamentally important, of course, to the iPhone experience is iOS. And iOS is the most advanced mobile operating system in the world.
When it comes to downloading most apps, iOS 15 is still supported by a lot of the ones you would go to download, though this may not be the case for too long, as with new iOS versions, apps tend to raise the minimum required iOS version to download them. Even so, you can still usually get the latest compatible version, which may still work just fine, depending on the app. Actually, downloading most apps seem to not take too long at all, unlike dealing with iCloud. As for using the apps, performance will really vary depending on how demanding they are, but I'm going to say that most things I tried felt usable in the very least. Not that you would want to actually use the iPhone SE anymore. And even if it's probably pretty obvious, let me be crystal clear. This is a very old phone, and it's not going to be a worthwhile experience anymore. You can find a 2nd gen SE for like not much more than $50, a 3rd gen maybe $100. If for some reason you really wanted an SE, maybe the home button and the smaller form factor, at least get one of the later ones that can still run the latest version of iOS. I don't think there's anyone who would actually look to use this phone outside of maybe just for the novelty for a while, but you never know, and there is something to be said about the classic design and form factor, though the mini iPhones are still fully up to date and at least somewhat bring it back, even if they're getting old now as well. The iPhone SE isn't obsolete in so much that it's incapable of accomplishing many of the tasks you might do on your smartphone. You probably could browse social media, play some basic games, and even stream video on here just fine. The issues come in the lack of battery life, dwindling support, and the fact that this phone is just too darn small. Yeah, look, I can appreciate this phone's size a whole lot, but that doesn't mean I'd actually want to use it. I'm perfectly content with my iPhone 15 Pro Max, thank you very much. All in all, the iPhone SE has held up far better than you would probably ever expect from any 2016 smartphone. It's funny comparing this phone to the Galaxy S7 that I recently reviewed. On one hand, the S7 feels far more modern from the design and big AMOLED screen, but on the other, the SE absolutely demolishes it in software support and how useful it could still potentially be today. Android's pretty open-ended, so you can still download a lot of apps, but the S7 hasn't had any major updates since Android 8 Oreo, which it got in 2018. Yeah, just terrible, and it feels its age when swiping around the interface. iOS 15, in contrast, still feels quite modern. Sure, it's missing a good few things from the newer updates, but it's still at its core the same software for the most part, and it doesn't require much adjustment coming from my 15 Pro, it's just a smaller phone. The iPhone SE has held up so well in design, software, power, and basically everything except the display, unless of course for you that size feels just right.
So the iPhone SE joins our incredible lineup of iPhones with the iPhone 6, 6 Plus, 6S, and 6S Plus. It's the strongest iPhone lineup we've ever had.
There are a lot of reasons. You could argue that the iPhone SE hasn't aged as gracefully as I think I've been indicating throughout this video. Those bezels, like it or not, are pretty thick, relatively speaking. That screen is small, even if it was the entire point of this phone. The camera and the hardware, while impressive for the time, has aged, and iOS 15 is only getting older. This phone has been left behind in the ever-quickly moving realm of smartphone technology, both literally and even in what it represents, a smaller legacy iPhone meant for a niche subset of users, but with all the quality of life of Apple's foremost flagships. We just don't see phones like this anymore, at least not really. The iPhone 16e might have some good elements, but it's just not the same thing. And the 2nd and 3rd generation SEs felt nowhere near as special as that first entry because honestly, they weren't. In the mid-2020s, the iPhone SE is not a phone you'd ever want to use, although in a pinch it would potentially get the job done, which on its own is pretty impressive. But still, this is basically a 2013 smartphone with 2015 hardware, and we're now about a decade down the line. At least on the surface, there's very little point for me to revisit this phone, even if I haven't looked at it since my review in 2021. But what I find so fascinating about the iPhone SE and so endearing is not the spec sheet, performance today, or iOS 15 support. It's so much more than that. What I believe makes this phone so special and so very much worth revisiting is this: the iPhone SE is timeless. This design and form factor is absolutely iconic and one of the most beautiful smartphones ever built by any company. And the fact that Apple brought it back when they didn't have to and made a genuinely great budget smartphone kind of out of nowhere, coming off the disaster that was the iPhone 5C. The SE second generation isn't timeless, nor is the third gen, but this phone? It absolutely is. The design has aged like a fine wine, not because you'd necessarily want to use it anymore, but because it's a gorgeous piece of tech that feels so good to hold, to mess around with, to even talk about. This is a smartphone that makes me feel excited about technology, that reignites that old Apple fanboy within that I've buried so deep down after years of cynicism, and what feels like ever increasingly boring new phones every release cycle. This is a phone that's worth talking about, a phone worth remembering.
The iPhone SE, the most powerful 4-inch phone ever created. We're always pushing forward and innovating and doing things that positively affect many people. It's something that Apple has been doing for over 40 years.
The iPhone SE is one of the greatest iPhones Apple has ever made. While you could call it lazy for just reusing the iPhone 5S design and that wouldn't be unjustified, does it really matter when the design is just this good? Does it matter when this phone not only had the best features of Apple's top-of-the-line flagships, but also some benefits like a cheaper price tag and surprisingly solid battery life? I would be shocked if Apple ever releases a budget smartphone anywhere near as great as the iPhone SE. It's been almost a decade and they haven't outdone themselves yet, but who knows? And in the meantime, at least we can look back at the iPhone SE today fondly. And it's kinda neat to see that this general flat-edge design lives on in modern smartphones today. And so with that, I think we're right about done here. It was a lot of fun looking at the iPhone SE today. It's been too long since we've looked at some older iPhones, so let me know if you want to see more of that by hitting the like button, and consider subscribing for more content just like this. And please, comment your thoughts down below on the SE. Is this one of the best iPhones ever? How do you feel about Apple now being fully done with the iPhone SE line altogether? Make sure you join our Discord community if you haven't already, and huge shout out to the channel members. Thank you guys so much for your support. And thank you all for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.